So I did some local summer travel for a change lately because, like a lot of you, I'm busy. So I don't have time to go jet-setting somewhere glamorous, and I decided to keep it close to home. But you know what? I did not let that get me down in terms of archaeology, and neither should you. What I want to remind you this episode is pretty much no matter where you are, you're probably not too far away from some archaeology and a fun day out with the family.
Dad, I haven't seen a car for an hour.
Oh, shut up, Audrey. You don't think Dad knows where he's going?
Thank you, Russ.
You're lost.
And this week, I went to Peterborough, just about a 50-minute train ride north of my pad in London, where I visited two sites. The Must Farm exhibit at the Peterborough Museum and Gallery, and Flad Fen Archaeology Park, just a couple miles outside of town. Now, these sites take us way back to the Bronze Age, which in Britain was about 2400 BC, so that's not long after the pyramids of Giza were built, up until about 800 BC, so a period of about 1600 years. At this time, the whole eastern part of England, known as the Fens, was a semi-underwater swamp because the sea levels were much higher then. Now, the Brits hired Dutchman Cornelius Vermeulen in the 1650s to drain the swamp.
And we are going to drain the swamp.
So since then, the land has continued to dry, and it's giving up its secrets over time, Must Farm being one of them. You see, in the Bronze Age, the whole area around Peterborough seemed to be one big marshy basin, and also a rather significant population center. And in 1999, archaeologist Martin Redding noticed some wooden stakes sticking out of a marshy bit of ground, did some preliminary investigation, and pretty soon they knew they were dealing with something special. Now, the excavations were tricky. It all took place in the mud, and even the most minute bits of evidence, seeds, pieces of thread, you name it, all had to be collected to extract as much information as possible from the site. Hence, the archaeologists did the whole thing lying down on their stomachs, sort of like the opposite of what Michelangelo did when he painted the Sistine Chapel. And just like with Michelangelo's work, this was painstaking stuff. The whole excavation took just over a year and 53 weeks and some change, which incidentally is probably longer than the site was occupied in the Bronze Age, but more about that later. And what they found was amazing. An intact Bronze Age settlement dating back to 850 BC, and I suppose they had plenty of evidence to do that dating, considering all that wood, which would have been used for radiocarbon dating and also dendrochronology or tree ring dating. There were 4 roundhouses on site, which would have been dwellings, and 1 rectangular building, which probably would have been for storage. Now, there probably were even more than that, but those would have been destroyed by subsequent activity at the site. Now, those roundhouses were pretty standard in Britain at this time, except this was a swamp, not dry land. So the houses were actually built on stilts, surrounded by a wooden palisade and connected by wooden platforms, what's known often on the continent as a pile dwelling. Now, the whole thing burned down, which is of course why it was abandoned and damaged, but also so well preserved. You see, burning can mineralize things, which does help to preserve them, but also because the whole structure was wooden, that fire caused the houses to sort of collapse whole into the water before everything was totally destroyed. And as we've seen in other swampy contexts, think of those bog bodies, this created ideal anaerobic preservation conditions. Anaerobic meaning lacking oxygen, which means the bacteria and other little critters that cause stuff to break down can't survive. So it's well preserved and in situ at the time of its destruction, earning it the name the Pompeii of England, of course after the site in Italy, which also was preserved in its destruction. Now, I have some real problems with that moniker, but more about that later. So these preservation conditions have given us a never-before-seen look into Bronze Age living, and the exhibition tells you all about it. So let's dive right in, shall we?
Has gone to 180, 30
34 years of age, Jeremy Wells.
From the remains of the houses, they could tell the construction was skilled and highly standardized, not at all haphazard. That plus the woodworking tools on site, they knew they were dealing with some skilled carpenters who had built houses like this before. This was not their first rodeo.
The Hardy project looks great, man. Demo really got kicked off on the right foot.
And their carpentry skills were in evidence all around, especially through two items which also attest to these people's mobility. First, there was an intact wheel, which is the oldest in Britain and probably, I'm guessing, one of the oldest in the world. And this wheel wasn't just made from one round piece of wood. It was actually made by 3 pieces of wood, which were smartly integrated into different components in the wheel to take advantage of their natural properties, like hardness, flexibility, durability, etc. Again, these folks knew what they were doing. Just as amazing was a group of 8 canoes found nearby, which were made by hollowing out whole logs. However, I'm going to talk about those in the context of the next video about Flag Fen, and you'll see why. The team also learned about what people ate, their diets, and how did they find that out? Well, first, the pottery, and there was pottery in spades, and there was food left intact in situ in that pottery, as well as residues that could be tested and looked at microscopically. And there were some pretty cool pieces. There was this group of nested pots like those Russian dolls. There was this tiny little cup, which as far as I could guess, would have been good for just only one. Most of all, there was this completely intact vessel, which was found with the porridge and spoons still inside after all these years. And where else did they learn about what these folks ate? Well, not from the food, but from what comes out the other end, human waste.
Somebody blows their nose and you want to keep it?
Actually, nastier than that. Just plain old shit, which when it's fossilized becomes something called a coprolite, a much more civilized word indeed. And what did they learn from these coprolites, you ask? Well, not surprising given the fact that they were living in a swamp, these people ate a lot more fish and eel as opposed to meat, much more it seems than other folks in the Bronze Age did. So in those coprolites, researchers found microscopic fish tapeworm as opposed to those that live in animals. And this was also attested to by the fact that they found fish traps intact nearby. They also hunted wild game like boar and deer, which the researchers found because they found butchered bones on site, as well as weapons for hunting on site. But there are 2 interesting points about this in particular. First, archaeologists did not find any large carcasses nearby, just small bits of bone, which suggests that these folks did their butchery somewhere else. And as we know, butchery is pretty dirty work. So this suggests some kind of concern for hygiene, just like we saw at Starcar. However, the archaeologists also found plenty of sheep bones and also agricultural tools like these sickles. So what that means is the people in the Bronze Age must have had a sort of base on land somewhere where they did their farming and they raised their herd animals like sheep and, of course, butchered them. So that speaks to a mobility from this stilt village to a bit of dry land, and they sort of lived off of both. And of course, they must have traveled back and forth on those boats. It's not like the water was very deep, but they did have to ferry a lot of stuff back and forth.
Help me! I can't swim! I'm drowning! Oh God, I'm drowning!
And in terms of food, of course, the archaeologists found that porridge, other seeds and pulses, and nuts, including hazelnuts, which are quite common at prehistoric sites. And fun fact, the archaeologists also got some insight into what kinds of recipes in particular these people prepared. For example, they found pots with residues of venison, but also honey, suggesting the people used it as a sweetener to baste their meat.
So now, to baste, after you've reduced the oven temperature...
And they found completely different pots used to prepare dairy and to prepare meat, suggesting the two were consumed separately. Was this sort of a form of prehistoric kosher?
Hello, Rabbi. I brought you some kosher wine.
We also got an unparalleled look into the domestic economy, which involved a lot of sewing. I must start by saying that it is exceedingly rare to find fabric from this time. Usually you only see instances of that, small bits associated with human burials or burials of gold hoards. However, here at Muss Farm, they found whole pieces of fabric at every stage in the production chain, from thread to yarn to whole pieces of woven fabric. So those Bronze Age women must have been pretty busy a lot of the day with this industry. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yowzers, how can you specifically associate the sewing with the women? Isn't that a trope?
Leave the sewing to the women. You go get some trimming.
Well, pretty much in all prehistoric contexts, which is mainly burials, sewing implements are almost exclusively associated with female bodies. And moreover, in the Roman times and the medieval times when we get writing, that too, you almost always see weaving discussing in the context of women. But it would be a big mistake to think of this as a sign of some kind of sexism or the subservience of women. You see, at this time, cloth was absolutely necessary for survival in the cold. It was also very important to the family economy, especially in England, where for centuries, processed wool and cloth was the most important export. The ability to make cloth is associated with female power in mythology as well. Think about Greek mythology, where the three fates weave the future, and other cultures have similar stories. So think about it kind of as a superpower. And weaving became so associated with women that the word distaff, or like spindle, actually became an adjective to mean female, and that's still in the dictionary today, although it's pretty old school. It's not something you're going to read very often. And the cloth that these women at Muss Farm made was of high quality. The thread count was as high as 26 per centimeter, which is actually significantly higher than a lot of common cloth today. And actually, their pottery, some of which we've already seen, was generally of finer quality than what's usually found at other Bronze Age sites, and there was also jewelry found at Muss Farm. So all in all, this speaks to these people being, more well-to-do than the average Bronze Ager. I wouldn't say high status, but well-to-do. Anyway, what happened to these folks? Why did their little village burn down? Were they attacked? Fortunately, it seems like everyone escaped the fire, and it was probably an accident. How do we know this? Well, there were no human remains on site except for one skull, and that skull seemed to predate the destruction and also didn't have signs of violence on it. After all, this was the Bronze Age. It was actually not unheard of to keep bits and pieces of grandma around the house just for the purposes of ancestor worship. Now, I don't have all the detail on this, but based upon the burn patterns on the site and some of the items, the archaeologists have a guess as to which house the fire started in. Now, that doesn't totally surprise me because I took forensic science once upon a time, and I know that a lot of these techniques are used in arson investigations. But seriously, though, these people were cooking all over the place in totally wooden structures. It just sounds like an accident waiting to happen to me. And here's the unfortunate thing. It seems like these houses were pretty brand spanking new at the time they burned down. In that sense, it's more like the Titanic than Pompeii. So anyway, how do we know this?
Trust me?
I trust you.
First of all, the people's garbage, the accumulation of stuff they just threw off the side of the house into the water, was pretty minimal, suggesting just a short period of occupation. Second, the wood used to build the place was not sort of weathered and seasoned the way you'd expect old construction wood to be. Third, that wood also lacked signs of bark beetles and other wood-dwelling critters you'd normally see in a building that had been standing for some time. And finally, the dendrochronology showed that the trees used to build the place were all felled in the winter or autumn of the same year, and there had been no replacement yet with newer wood, which you'd expect to happen in an all-wooden house that had been used for some time. So, irony of ironies, they put in all that work, and the whole thing went up in flames because somebody forgot to turn off the stove.
Stupid!
And after years of analysis on hundreds of artifacts, thousands of environmental samples, and exactly 18,216 pieces of wood, Must Farm was finally ready to show to the public, although the current exhibition is only open for a limited period of time. It's a terrific exhibit. Just one room. I probably spent an hour there reading everything and watching all the videos, which are very informative. However, they really need to drop the Pompeii of England bull, because quite frankly, it's going to turn people off. Pompeii was a city buried in ash. Must Farm was a small settlement that burned down. Let's not overpromise and underdeliver. That said, Must Farm is an incredible site in its own right. No need to compare it with Pompeii. So even though you probably won't make it to Peterborough to see the exhibit before it closes on September 28th, 2024, it will probably find a permanent home at another institution. Moreover, that wasn't the only point of the video. I'm trying to encourage you to explore your local area. You'll probably be surprised at what archaeological adventures await. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.